Welcome to All About Capital Campaigns, a podcast that provides fuel for your nonprofit's growth. Each week, hosts Andrea Kihlstedt and Amy Eisenstein, co-founders of the Capital Campaign Toolkit, provide practical tips about raising more money for your nonprofit organization. The Capital Campaign Toolkit is a support system for nonprofit leaders who are running capital campaigns. At capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, you can download a step-by-step guide for your capital campaign and get many other free resources. This podcast is recorded on a live webinar every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join the live session and get your questions answered by signing up today at toolkittalks.com.
I have invited one of my favorite people in the world here, Andy Robinson, to join me for this call. Some of you may know Andy or of Andy because we have mentioned Andy's book, the book he and I wrote about Train Your Board, full of training exercises on others of these calls before. So I am Andrea Kihlstedt. I am calling in from the South Bronx, New York, which is where I always seem to be since I don't seem to go to the shore. In fact, I am happy to be here, and I am the co-founder of Capital Campaign Toolkit with Amy, and I'm so happy to introduce my friend and co-author and partner in a variety of things that we have done together, including a website at one point, Andy Robinson. Andy, who are you? Where are you? Why are you here? Tell us about yourself.
Tell us the meaning of life. I am Andy Robinson. I'm sitting in my home in Plainfield, Vermont. I am 41 years a fundraiser. I am 26 years a consultant. I'm an author of 6 books about fundraising and nonprofit stuff. Andrea and I did one together, as she mentioned. And I'll tell you a funny Amy Eisenstein story, and then we'll get started. I was watching one of Amy's videos. I don't know, it's a couple of years ago. And my spouse came over and was looking over my shoulder while I was watching. And after about 3 minutes, she looked at me and she said, "This woman is the female version of you." So Amy and I are soulmates in ways that we don't even understand. And you are lucky to have Andrea and Amy in your lives because they are both brilliant at what they do. And the Capital Campaign Toolkit is a genius concept, and I think it's delivering on its promise every day. So I'm here because Andrea is a friend and she asked me to pinch it for Amy.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Andy. You know, that's a great story. It explains why you and I got along so well was we were working on that book together, and it explains why I get along so well with Amy. I'd never thought about that before. Let me just, Mike Americaner, it's nice to have you. Your first time, welcome.
Nice.
Here's the drill. And for those of others of you who are first timers, here's what goes on. Andy and I will start with the topic that we had decided to start with. We're going to back that around for a while. The topic, so you know, is training. We wrote a book on training. Both of us have done a lot of training. Andy has done unbelievable amounts of training, board training and otherwise. So we're going to talk, a lot. So we're going to talk about that and about sort of tips and what it is you need to know about training. While we chat about that, we want you to type in your questions in the Q&A. Now, you can type in questions about training and about the subjects that we're talking about, but you may have other questions, in which case, about capital campaigns or fundraising. If you want to ask other questions, you're welcome to do that too. But do be sure you type it into the Q&A because the chat tends to go by really quickly and it's hard for us to keep up with the chat. So type in your questions after 10 or 15 minutes. When we see we have some good, robust questions, Andy and I will pivot over to your questions, and we will spend the rest of the time with you really responding to your questions. Now, I should say, Andy, that beforehand, I did get an email with a question from Barbara Hudson. So I just want to highlight that. because I want to, at some point we're going to want to address it and ask people on the call to address it. She wanted to know if we or anyone else has experience with virtual kickoffs, virtual campaign kickoffs. So we're not going to start with that, but I don't want to miss it. Those of you who have done that, I'm going to invite you to chat in about your experience. And Barbara, thank you so much for sending me your question in advance. It's always nifty when people do that. Andy, you are a master trainer of master trainers. And if you were talking to people, let's assume there are people on this call who really don't do much training or haven't done much training or don't think about what are the core things they need to know if they're going to train their board, train their staff. What do you think of?
So you want the three most important things you need to know to be an effective trainer?
That's a good way to do it.
Okay, sure. First of all, people don't remember what you say. They remember what they do. And there's data on this. I mean, there's social psychology that studied this. And I could stand here and lecture you about all the things you need to know about topic X or topic Y. That's not going to stick. What's going to stick is people actually getting their fingers and their hands and their minds into the work. So answer number one to the question is don't talk at people, give them stuff to do. Give them an exercise, give them an activity, give them a question to answer, give them a conversation to have. That's part one. Part number two is don't assume that all the expertise is in your head, the person who's running the training, who's at the front of the room or who's at the top of the Zoom screen. I feel like the best role for trainers, and I'll put that word in quotes, is to pull out the wisdom of the audience, of the participants, because people know a lot more than I do. And if you can get the group to actually engage on the topic and work together, that's good. I mean, that gets you better information. It's a way to honor people's expertise. And the third thing I would say, and I flunk this one regularly, is try not to come in with a fire hose and give them so much information that they're overwhelmed. A loving critique that's been given to me as a trainer is a lot of my workshops are like drinking out of a fire hose because there's so much and people can't retain all of it. And my answer is whatever you remember is what you were meant to remember, and that's okay. And if you don't, if you're not writing down every single word and you're not don't worry about it. Like whatever sticks is what was meant to stick. But we have to scale the content to the time, and we have to scale the content to the bandwidth of the people we're working with. And good training matches those two things. The amount of information is scaled to the capacity of people to absorb it. So those are three tips. What would you add?
Those are three great tips. Now, I want to ask everybody on the call the following question. Think back to the last training you took, not you gave, but think back to the last training you took.
Yeah.
And think about one or two things that stick with you from that training. Right? What do you remember? Is there one thing you remember? If you think of something that you remember from a training, chat it in, right? Let's see if you have one thing to remember.
And I'm gonna add a little fillip to the side of what you just said. The thing you remember might have been content, but it might have been something about the experience, right? It might have been how you felt. It might have been something you heard another participant say that got your attention, right? So be broad on this. What do you remember? What did you retain from that? And see where it goes. I mean, while they're typing, I'll pick on you, Andrea. What's one thing you remember from a training?
Yeah. So I'm almost embarrassed to say this.
I'll keep an eye on chat while you're doing that.
Yeah, I think it's true of most everybody, and almost invariably, what I remember from a training is what I said or what I chatted in or the question I asked.
Yeah, that's not unusual. That's not unusual, right?
That's what sticks, right? Or when I said something or asked a question and somehow ended up feeling foolish about it, right? I remember that feeling of feeling like I had asked the wrong question or
like you asked a dumb question,
a dumb question, right? Or I remember sitting back and having questions but being afraid to raise my hand. I remember that a lot. So do you remember that? Yeah. I mean, it's amazing actually how little you remember of what the trainer says.
Yeah. So I think the math is people remember 20% of what you say as a presenter, but they remember 90% of what they do or what they said, right? So I think this is interesting because it's partly a matter of creating the space where people can engage themselves and they get to have questions and they get to come up with their own answers and they get to work with the material.
Yeah, I mean,
so yeah, I feel like we're even jumping ahead here, Andrea. We need to do the rationale for why this is important, not just how to do it. But if you're doing a capital campaign, if you're doing any sort of fundraising campaign, if you're trying to build a functional board that does its work well, nobody comes out of the womb knowing these things, right? In theory, there are born fundraisers and born board members, but I don't buy it. I think it's all stuff that we learn. And so the argument for training or education or development is that if you want to have a functional team, like if you want board members who will engage in your campaign and are fearless and educated and smart, you have to train them to do that. If you have a campaign committee that is forming and they need to understand how to do their work, somebody needs to teach them that. So one of the things that Andrea and I have said, and other people have said this too, is that a lot of us are accidental trainers, right? It's not what we aspire to do. We didn't show up for the Train the Trainer workshop. We showed up for something else. And lo and behold, we had to teach it to other people. So part of my spiel today is I want you to embrace the fact that you are an educator and you're an organizer. And part of your job, whatever hat you're wearing today, is to pass on information to other people and help them build their confidence. So we have to do this. And it's sort of easy to sit around and complain and say, my committee isn't doing its work or they're not stepping up. And then the question is, if you're the consultant or the staff members, like, what are you not doing that's making it harder for them to step up, right? What's our role as the leadership to help other people sort of enter this role? So what are you seeing on chat?
Yeah, I was just looking at it. It's really fascinating. I'm looking at the chat. And of course, it turns out that what we're talking about is borne out here, right? Donna has said that she remembers the trainer said, finish the story, which has stuck with her, gave her a part of a story and she had to finish the story. Of course, she remembers that because she was the active participant in it, right? It was an exercise that involved her. Yeah. So Diana, it's neat that you felt inspired by a training to pursue a career in fundraising. Whoever that trainer was should really feel great.
Yeah, right.
And
that's
Gary
lovely.
Talks about concepts and stories that the trainer articulated. It is easier to hear stories.
Yes.
I love this one. Camilla says that she remembers an exercise that was writing an obituary of the organization she was working with.
Nice.
That's a powerful.
What do you want to leave behind when the organization's gone? Yeah.
Really?
That's good.
Right.
That's good.
Time, quality, dollars, time, and quality, you can optimize only 2 or 3. That's what you remember, right? I mean, it's very practical. It got you thinking.
That's very interesting, yeah.
So here's one more good one, and then we'll move on. The best training Meredith ever had was a speaker who in 45 minutes helped us build our own social media plan, going back to our organization. He had to fill in the blank option. We put in our own personal info, direct responses, time-sensitive, applicable, and customized. Again, it was all about you, Meredith. It wasn't about what the trainer
Here's the formula. Now apply it to your circumstance. Yeah. That's good.
So
that's good.
So no, it's really fascinating to think about that. And when you go to the next training any of you go to, pay attention to what it is you remember, right? And what and how, as a trainer, you can put things out there that will have other people adding something from their experience.
So one of the interesting things for me about the pandemic, as we've all been in lockdown, is that, like many people, 95% of my work has moved online. And since the pandemic hit, I have facilitated, I think, 95 or 100 webinars and meetings and workshops in the last 14, 15 months. And what I'm finding is that as a trainer, I have to be even clearer and better in this space. If I'm setting up an exercise, I really have to have clear instructions. The technology has to work, all of that. But for some folks, it's actually made it easier for them to engage. And I have enjoyed the transition online. I'll be happy to be in a room with people again. That will be lovely. But I think the principles that we're talking about here are true when you're in the room with people, but they're also true if you're doing this stuff virtually. So best practice sort of are best practices, regardless of the context you're doing them in.
Yeah. And put in your questions about training. Have you ever been a trainer? What are the questions you have about how to pull this off? Yeah. I mean, what Andy has described, which really, for me, it was an aha at least 20 years ago when I'll tell a little story. So I had created the fundraising school in Indianapolis asked me to develop a 3-day training about capital campaigns. I had just written that big book and I thought, okay, that's cool. So, and it was a big honor, right? That's a pretty substantial organization. I had 3 days of training. So what did I do to develop that training? I sat and I wrote out 3 days worth of content for that. And I broke it down into outlines, right? And I don't look like that, Andy. This story has a better ending than that. Okay, so sorry. I broke it down. I wrote out when the breaks were and how many, an hour and a half, and then 10-minute break, and then lunch, and then a 10-minute break. And I apportioned the content, and I went and I gave the training, and everybody clapped. And then I came home, and a friend of mine was a really good trainer, a really experienced trainer. And I said to him, I have some sense that this didn't go the way I really hoped it would go. Next time I do it, will you please come and take it and then give me feedback?
Great.
So he did. This was my friend Michael Miller. He actually sat for 3 days the next time I had the opportunity to do this training. And at the next day, I called him up. I said, Michael, I really want your sense of this training. He said, Andrea, I think we better get together for me to talk to you about it.
We're going to have a little intervention.
And I learned from him that I couldn't present content, that the task of being a really good trainer is to organize the content and then design exercises that gets the participants to provide the content.
Based on their own expertise, based on their own experience, based on their own wisdom, based on their own hopes and feers and dreams.
Right. And that was a whole different mindset that my job as a trainer and your job as a trainer is to design exercises that engage people.
Okay, so let's go with an example of this.
They have to provide the content that you were hoping that they wanted to provide. Now, just a little end of that, I did redesign that entire training. I did go and teach it again at the fundraising school, and I taught it for years with my friend Bob Pierpont. I believe that same training is now still being taught at the fundraising school with those exercises with minimal shifts. So thanks to Michael Miller, that's how I learned to be a trainer.
I have a friend of mine who's a consultant who says the consultant should never work harder than the client. Totally believe that. The corollary here is that the trainer should never work harder than the group in the room. And, one way that you're doing it well is that you're not carrying the whole burden of the workshop on your back. That the students, the participants are actually doing a lot of, if not most of, the work. So I want to give you an example of a specific skill that everybody needs to know in fundraising. And I don't know if you're expecting this or not, but the skill is listening, right? The great skill in fundraising is not talking or pitching or spieling. The great skill is getting other people to tell you their story and how it connects to your organization. And one of the old-time heroes of the trade is a man who passed away recently named Jerry Panis. And I guess we lost Jerry about 2-3 years ago. And he had a phrase. He talked about listening the gift, which I think is a lovely metaphor. Thinking about this, I have developed an exercise that I use often when I'm teaching people how to be better ambassadors for their organization. And I think many of you have heard of the idea of the elevator pitch. And, this is the idea if you were locked on an elevator with somebody for 90 seconds, could you convince them to do something? And a lot of our board members obsess about this. It's like, give me the 5 bullets. Like I'm supposed to come up, if I memorize these 5 bullets and I say them compellingly, wallets will open, and it's bogus. So I've flipped the metaphor, and what I'm promoting now is what I would call elevator questions. Meaning, if you had a brief conversation with somebody, what questions could you ask relating to your mission that would stimulate a conversation about your work, but it starts from the donor's perspective. It's not you saying, I have something I want to tell you. It's, tell me about you. How do you interact with this? Like, what's your experience around this topic? So I have used this many times with board members and others where we put them in small groups, especially if I'm training a board. And I'll say, what are some questions you could ask that would initiate a conversation that relates to the work you do in the world? And people come up with all this brilliant stuff. And what's nice is once you have the list, they can actually sort of memorize some of the questions, which is very different from memorizing the pitch. And they can use that to start conversations and suss people out and see where they are.
Yeah, let's have some chat. Chat in some questions. Chat in. Imagine yourself in an elevator with someone, and think about. And the elevator gets stuck on a floor, so you have a little while, right? And there's somebody there with you you don't know. What question might you ask that person that would start a conversation about the topic of your elevator of your organization?
Yes. And don't be wedded to the elevator. This can be in the grocery aisle, right? This could be, on Andrea's favorite trail along, the west part of Central Park, whatever. If you just had a random conversation with somebody, you're talking to them at a party. Like, what sort of questions might you ask to initiate a discussion about your work? So chat is awesome for this. So feel free and think on this. By the way, if this feels like it's a little bit of work, if you have to sit and think about it, that's good. That's appropriate.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at what people are typing in, Andy, and realize that it's easy to think about really general questions. It's a little more challenging to think about questions that would tie the conversation back to your mission in some way.
So I'll give a couple examples. As you and I were talking about, I have worked over the years a lot with land conservation groups, land trusts. And so some of the questions we've come up in that context are things like, how long have you lived in this community? Well, I've lived here for 20 years. How have you noticed the landscape changing over the last 20 years? How do you feel about those changes? So that leads to a conversation about land conservation and whether that's meaningful to the person or not. If you work at the animal shelter, you might say to somebody, tell me about your favorite pet that you've ever had, right? How did you feel about that pet? What was their name? Do you have pets now? And so, again, many people, some people have gone through life without a pet, but pretty much many people have had pets in their lives and have opinions about that. So, tell me about you is a good question, but we're really trying to bring it to the mission of your organization in some way.
Yeah, so we have some good questions coming in here. Andy, Diana has asked this question. I have volunteered to give an overview of the fundamentals of effective partnership and development for my all-volunteer organization. What would you suggest as the main topics to discuss or not to forget to cover? Love it.
That's a great question. So, and Andrea, do you have the ability to send people stuff after this?
Well, it's a little dicey, but I can put links into the chat.
You can try and do that. Okay. So my go-to exercise on this question, Diana, is something that's in our book, and it's called the cycle of fundraising. And it's this idea that fundraising is not just soliciting money. It's identifying potential donors. It's cultivating and educating them. It's asking them to give. It's thanking them and embracing them. And it's looking for ways to involve them in the work so they feel a stronger sense of connection. Having done that, one says to them, can you recommend somebody else who might want to participate? And you've completed the cycle. And for me, this is the baseline thing I do as a fundraising trainer, is help people understand that fundraising is a whole suite of activities. It's about relationship management. It's about making people feel like they're part of the family. And even those even those board members, staff members, whoever is like, I'm not a fundraiser, I don't want to ask for money. My response is always, there are 25 ways that you can help with fundraising without asking for a gift. And let's think about what those ways are and how we can best plug you into the model so that you can be productive. And what I can do is I'll put my email in the chat. And then anyone who wants a copy of that exercise as a PDF, go ahead and pull my email me after this is over. I will send it to you.
That's
it's super easy.
Way to do it.
That's a good solution.
Yes. And now, Diana, here's what I want to say to you. When you think about doing this training, by all means, make a list of topics that you want people to learn about. But then don't make an outline of what it is you want to tell them. Think about an exercise for each topic or some of the topics that would get them telling you what it is you want them to learn.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You have to flip it so that you get people discussing the topic, and as they discuss it, you can call out when they've hit it right, which is a really different thing than to say, here are 7 topics and here's everything I know about the 7 topics, and I only have 40 minutes, so I have 6 minutes on each topic, right?
Oh, God, that's harsh. That's so harsh.
I mean, so think about it differently. Think about yourself as the designer of an exercise. Now, I want to go back to this question, this elevator question concept.
Yes.
Because another thing to know about training is that when you have a group of people that you're doing a training with, you have multiple choices and things you can do in terms of how you organize people. So you can say to the whole group, who has some questions that they might ask somebody about that would stimulate conversation. That's one way to do it.
Yep.
Or you can say, let's break the group up into groups of 3. I want each group of 3 to spend the next 3 minutes coming up with 5 questions that you would ask. And then the groups come together and they come up with 5 questions, and then you do some popcorning around.
Yeah, and you write them on the old flip chart, or you put them on the whiteboard. Yep.
Right. So you have all kinds of ways of dividing people up. You can create little groups where you can do fish bowls, where you have a few people on the inside of a group talking about a topic and people on the outside watching. And then you say to the people on the outside, what are the things that came up that you thought were really important from the conversation on the inside?
That's good.
Right. There are many choices to make training more active and lively than simply standing in the front of the room or on your Zoom and telling people what it is you want them to know.
On my business card, I describe my work 3 ways. I say I'm a trainer, I say I'm a facilitator, and I say I'm a consultant. And I think those 3 things all thread together. So if you're one of those folks that does consulting, but you don't necessarily think of yourself as a trainer, yeah, you are. I feel like that's part of the work, right? Yes. You can't avoid that. Andrea, can I tell you my favorite backwards icebreaker question?
Please.
I've used this one. Feel free to steal this, people. I've get people in small groups at the beginning of fundraising training, like 3 or 4 people, I'll have them huddle at a table or whatever. And I'll say, I want you to discuss the following question. What's one thing you know about fundraising that's probably wrong? And then they just talk about this, and then they come back to me, and I'll say, well, what would you come up with? And we'll write them up on the flip chart. And they unpack their own misconceptions.
Oh, how interesting. What kinds of things do they come up with, Andy?
Oh, like a classic one is, I don't know anyone who has money. Right. Like I believe that, but now that I think more deeply about it, I realize that's probably not true. Right. So you can let them, unpack their own stuff in front of you. And what's great about that is sometimes they come up with stuff that's accurate and sometimes they don't, but it's a teachable moment. And it's based on what they've brought. There was a question here about the pyramid.
Pamela has asked a question. It's a good one. I've been sort of thinking about it, actually. I'm interested in what you say, Andy.
Sure.
I want to provide the board an understanding of the fundraising pyramid. Any tips on how to do that?
Well, why don't I describe the pyramid so people know what that is, and then you can take the first jump at the answer and I'll come in. A classic tool to help teach people about fundraising is a pyramid. And the idea of the pyramid is that there are more people at the lower levels and there are fewer people at the higher levels. And sometimes it's called a pyramid. Sometimes it's called a gift chart. Sometimes it's called a gift range chart. It's got multiple names. And what you do is this is a tool for mapping out how many gifts you need at each level of the pyramid to reach your campaign goal. And, Andrea and I have debated the numbers, but what's typical is your lead donor is probably 10 to 20 to 25% of your goal, depending on your campaign. And then you've got a second tier of donors that are another 10 to 15%. And then you got a third tier of donors that are like another 10 or 15%. And it can go down as low as you want. And this is really any sort of fundraising campaign 101 is you need to map out how many gifts you need at each level to reach your overall goal. So with that in mind, Andrea, how would you teach that to a group?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because it's so tempting with something like that to show it and to explain it. Right? It's really
Which
tempting.
isn't inherently bad.
Which is inherent, well, but not ideal. So,
I agree. Go.
So it might. I mean, I'm just making this up. Right? There are a number of things that I would do. I undoubtedly would talk a little about the Pareto principle. And the Pareto principle is the 80-20 rule, roughly, or the 90-10 rule.
Or the 70-30 rule, whatever it is.
Rule. It explains how gifts do not come in equal or even amounts. And in fact, Pareto was an Italian economist, and he figured that out, not having to do anything with fundraising, but he figured out that in general, that it is an economic principle that 20% of the work yields 80% of the results. And that's true in all sorts of things. And they've done all sorts of studies on it. So, for example, 20% of the drivers cause 80% of the accident. 20% of the sales force in what used to be department stores do sell 80% of the goods.
The product. Yeah, interesting.
I mean, and this is true in a huge number of things.
That's fascinating.
And Pareto actually came up with this. I don't think this is apocryphal. The story is that Pareto was a gardener. He was an Italian gardener. And he would go out and he would look at his peas. Andy, you're a gardener. So you can look at your peas and see if this is true. And he noticed that about 20% of his pea pods created 80% of his peas.
Nice. Nice. So this is the God in the machine.
This is the God in the machine. So anyway, I would probably start out by talking about the Pareto principle. And then I would ask people, all right, as we look at the Pareto principle, what does that mean in terms of fundraising? And if we've got to raise $1 million or $1,000, what would the consequences of that be?
Interesting. That's good. I think someone asked about the spelling. I think it's Paretto.
I think it's Pareto, I believe.
One T, okay.
Pareto, Pareto. I forgot. Emilio Pareto.
I will tell you, there is, in the book that we've mentioned today too many times, there is an exercise called Building a Gift Chart, and it's how you teach a group to do this. So I don't even remember what's in the exercise, but if you want the exercise, email me. My email's in the Zoom chat, and I can also send you a copy of the Building an Exercise.
It's
nice.
Pareto. Thank you.
Vilfredo. Well, what a name. I'm envious. I want a name like Vilfredo.
The book that Andy is talking about is this Train Your Board and Everyone Else to Raise Money. And it is written by Andy and me.
Wave it around. Come on, Andrea. Do the sales thing. There you go. Thank you so much. That's all you need.
It is a compilation of, I think, 53 exercises that are compiled in cookbook format. And in reality, when Andy and I were figuring out what this book should be, and we were on the telephone, me in New York and him in Vermont, and we were sort of debating how to go about doing it, both of us went to our cookbook shelves.
That's true. Remember that, Andy? It's true. Yeah, that's how we designed it. Was off of a cookbook. Yeah, that's pretty funny. I forgot that. Down
our cookbook. So the idea was that instead of saying the oven had to be 350 degrees, we would say, well, it will take 30 minutes to do this.
Right. Put people in groups of 4 and give them 8 minutes to do this exercise. Yeah.
Right, of what you need. You need a flip chart paper, and you need magic markers, and you need tape or whatever.
And you need a little courage. So let me go back to the questions here. Here's a question from Aaron Stroman. It says, in regards to in-person training, how do you feel about a training guide or notes for the attendees? Good idea, bad idea. If you use them, how exhaustive or vague are the materials that you hand out? I have an opinion. Do you want me to go first, or do you want to
go first, Andy?
So, Aaron, it's an excellent question. And I would say it depends on the content and the group. for example, and this is getting meta here, in the last several years, I have done train the trainer workshops where I'm training other trainers how to train people, right? And in that case, I produce a really detailed trainer agenda, like minute by minute, which is something I used to do back in the day. I'm less inclined to do it now because I'm more experienced. But I would prepare that for myself. Then I would give it to the group. And I would say, I'm going to show you, I'm going to like train you to do stuff while I'm doing it. I'm also going to demonstrate how I'm training you and the choices I am making as a trainer moment by moment through this material. And in that case, I am fully transparent. I give them all of my thinking in advance at the event, sometimes after, because that is my job, just to teach them to think a certain way. And I want to reveal my thought process to them. On the other hand, if I've got like 45 minutes on Zoom to teach somebody something specific around fundraising or board development or whatever, I might send them a handout or two in advance to prime the pump, but generally I'm just showing up and doing the work and then giving them materials afterward. So I think it's a choice based on the group and the content, and I don't have like one answer for that.
Well, Andy, I have changed my views about this over time.
Speak.
I'm interested actually in knowing, for those of you who are on the call, I want you to chat in. When you take notes, bring notes home or get slides after a webinar or something, what percentage of the time do you actually look at them?
Yeah, great question.
Just give a 0% to 100%. How often do you actually pull them out or print them out and use them? Do you really file them and use them?
We're getting a wide range. Now, Andrea, there's another point to this before you finish your point, which is for some people, the process of taking notes is not for looking at them later. It's for imprinting them in their brain in real time. Some people absorb information by writing it down in the moment. Right. So the notes are not always for later. Sometimes the notes are for now.
Right. And here,
so,
it's interesting, Andy, to look at the responses here. We have Daniel looks at them always.
Yeah, and right. I see 10%.
Looks at them at 10%.
Yeah, we got everything. So
5%. Right. I mean, I think there are some percentage of us, myself included, who go away with great sort of beliefs that we're actually going to use them. And then periodically I have to clean out my files of these darn things that I've never looked at.
I have notebooks from conferences I went to 20 years ago that I have never looked at. I am totally that guy.
But let me make a suggestion to you. First,
yes.
So when you are training, you do need to accommodate different learning styles.
Good. I'm just going to go there too. So you go there first and I'll follow you. Right.
So there are, as you can see from the chat, there are some percentage of the people who really do make use of those slides or notes after the fact. And because there are some of them, you probably should have some takeaway, something that people can actually remind themselves of what happened. And I think it's actually a better idea to spend the last 15 or 20 minutes of any session, if it's a day-long session, getting people to take their own notes. Guiding them through the sections and finding out what would be useful for them and getting them to type it in or to write it out.
Yes.
So that the notes they end up with are not what were in your mind, the trainer, but the notes they end up with are the notes that they pull that are going to be relevant to their learning and that they really want to take home.
Yeah. So we call this action planning, which is let's make an action plan based on what you learned. How will you implement what you learned today is my favorite question. And actually carving out some time to do that in addition to the content you're delivering is hugely important. So thank you for naming that.
So the answer, I think, to your question, Aaron, is that you need to do both and. You need to present something for people to take home, and you need to give them an opportunity to do what Andy calls it, an action plan, and that will be good. Now, Wendy, you have said you may have missed it. What is it you're missing? What have I missed that you weren't missing?
Go and put it back in the Q&A.
How many slides would you use is the question. How many slides?
Oh, it depends on the material and how much time I have. I mean, I have done webinars, remote meetings with 5 slides, and I've done them with 40. And it just depends on the content and how much time. I mean, if we're going to talk slides, I'll run with this for 30 seconds. You want to make sure there's at least one interesting image on each slide. You probably want to limit the number of words per slide to 20 to 30 max.
Oh, how about like 10?
I'm good with that. Totally fine with that. Okay. The slide is not all the notes for your talk. The slide is the outline. It's the highlights, or maybe it's a story. I have done slides that have been just an image with no words because that image might convey what I'm trying to convey. And so, you can find your own wisdom on this. I would say if you're having lots of interactive time with people, you can actually squeeze in a few more slides. Like maybe I show 3 or 4 slides and we talk about them, and then I give the group 10 or 15 minutes to work with the content. And then we come back. And this is the classic thing, is you present some content, you give the group the chance to work with the content, and then you ask them to reflect on what they've learned and how they might use it. And it is that cycle over and over again. Some material, chance to work the material, the chance to make meaning out of it. What are you going to do with that material now that you have it? And if I'm doing like a half-day training, I might be going through that cycle 6 or 7 times in a 3-hour block. And it pretty much always sort of looks like that. So I think the amount of slides is really linked to how much work you're giving the group to do when you're not talking at them with slides.
Andy, what you described is so essential. It is.
It's foundational.
The foundational of being a good trainer and
good teacher, good instructor, good facilitator.
No, but I'll bet you anything that many of the people on this call don't get how to do that, because it's such a radical departure from telling people what you know. And it's very hard, in my experience, to make that shift. When you do make that shift, all of a sudden your task as a trainer becomes radically different. So, Andy, why don't you describe a really simple set of content, an exercise that you would have people do, and how you would get them to tell you. So let's actually do that for a mini segment.
So before we do that, I'm going to take a quick side trip. Do I have a minute to do that?
You do, yes.
Okay. So, and make sure you bring me back to that, because you just asked an excellent question. I want to give people like a minute and a half of learning theory here. And there are many, 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 many learning theories. The one that I like to teach, there's a couple of them, but one of them is called VARK, V-A-R-K. And this is an acronym. V stands for visual. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us learn by absorbing images. A is auditory. Some of us learn by hearing, but also by speaking. Some of us process our thoughts out loud by talking through them. That's a mark of an auditory learner. R is reading and writing. And if you're one of those people who makes meaning of stuff by writing it down and then reading your notes later, you're one of those R people. And K is kinesthetic. Kinesthetic are people who like to learn stuff by manipulating them with their hands, by actually physically engaging with material. We're all 4, right? We all learn all 4 of those ways, but some of us have preferred learning styles. So in my fantasy world, you're designing something that actually works for all 4 types of learners. As you're putting together content and exercises, you are creating stuff that visual people can embrace, etc. And this is a big lift, because it's sort of easy to show slides and talk at people, right? And you're missing the kinesthetic people for sure. And depending on your slides, you may be missing the visual people. I mean, it's very hard to hit all 4 of those things. So, per your question, let's say, I'll give you the example I already gave you, and then maybe there'll be another one. If I wanted to improve the listening skills, that was the intention. I want to teach my solicitors and folks who are engaging with the community to be better ambassadors and better listeners. What I might do is say to them, what are some questions you could ask people that would stimulate a conversation about your work? And they would sit in small groups and they would, talk and write and huddle. And then when I bring them back, I would say to them, what did you learn from that conversation? Let's hear from your groups. What questions did you come up with? And then I would say to them, write down the 3 questions that you might use in the next week to start a conversation with somebody. And if we really wanted to nail it, we could then go around the room and say, everybody say your favorite question that you want to use in the community and pledge to do it in the next week with at least one person.
Right. So did everybody hear that? I mean, Andy just described about a 15-minute process, something like that?
Yeah, 15, 20 max.
15, 20-minute process in which he said almost nothing. He would start by saying, listening skills are really the best way to make a gift. Let us work on how to develop your listening skills. And the way to do that is by asking questions. Then he would stop.
Bingo.
He would simply give them exercises and have them talk about what they came up with and have them talk about which ones were best and why they worked, right? And in the end, he might come back around and say, all right, what did you learn from this exercise? Yep. People are going to say that listening comes from good question asking, right? And then they would remember that because that's what they said.
So if this is great, Andrea, thank you. If you have a group, if you're working with me and I've got you for like a day-long workshop, by the afternoon, I find myself apologizing and I say, I'm sorry that I've asked this question 5 times already, but the question is, what did you just learn from that exercise? Right. What's your takeaway, right? And I'm always looking for more interesting ways to ask that question, but it's the go-to, right? It's the lazy man's fallback debriefing question is, what did you just learn? And it can, and I will give you a little hint if you're a trainer. Often you ask that question and there's the awkward pause because people are processing. Don't jump on the pause. Like let that space be there because people need space and time and quiet to process. It feels awkward. What I'll do if I'm really getting nervous, I might say, okay, and this is the moment where I feel awkward because nobody is answering my question. But if I sit here and I look pathetic long enough, somebody will open their mouth and will bail me out. And then everybody laughs. And then somebody says, well, here's what I learned. Part of what you have to learn as a good teacher is not to fill all the space. And sometimes you want to give groups silence because some people process better when they're not listening to me or you talk. They need that silence to process. So I think that's another thing to think about as you're designing your work is how much silence are you building into it? And are you being comfortable with that?
Well, and I promise you that no one is going to let you sit there for even 3 minutes.
Right. It might be 90 seconds and it feels like 10 minutes.
Right, but no,
sit there and smile.
There's a famous example. You remember who Carl Rogers is?
Sure, he's a psychologist.
Yeah, he was a psychologist.
Famous psychologist, mid-century, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And he had
I love these notes.
Class.
Yeah,
he taught at Yale or something, and he had a famous class where he would gather with the students and he would sit down and the students would come and he wouldn't say anything. He just wouldn't say anything.
Wait for the group to respond. That's psychology in real time.
Right, that's right.
Brilliant. So nice stuff. I love this. Someone says this is jazz music methodology, and the answer is absolutely right on.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, we're also getting a lot of shout outs to Jerry Panis today, which is sort of sweet. So
Jerry, the other person we should give shout outs to is Simone. I know, because Simone did a lot of training, and she felt strongly that she would never use slides. She didn't believe in slides.
I stayed away from slides for years. I was the last man with a flip chart. So I should say, for those who don't know, Simone Joyaux was an alpha fundraiser, an alpha fundraising trainer based in Rhode Island, worked all around the world, spent part of her year in France. Her parents were from France. And she was brilliant, and she passed away in the last couple of weeks, a little unexpectedly. So a lot of us who knew Simone and worked with her professionally miss her. And she is another giant of the field. In some ways, Jerry is a giant. Simone's a giant. We are walking in the footsteps of giants here, and we miss her.
It is true. Yeah, Simone really had a wonderful sense of humor, and
can I say badass? I guess I just did. She was a badass.
She was a badass. Yes, you can say that on this.
Say that with this group. Apologies if I offended anyone.
That any day.
All right. Are there more questions?
So, we're going to, while people ask their final questions, I'm going to give a little promo for the Capital Campaign Toolkit because Amy and I have concocted a special opportunity for all you guys who've gotten used to this Monday Toolkit Talk that we do. Amy and I we're going to take 6 weeks off this summer, I think starting in mid-July and going through August or something like that. And we thought you might miss us during that time. So we want to encourage you to sign up for the Essentials level. That's the basic level of the Capital Campaign Toolkit. And you will get a $500 discount. That's $250 a month each month.
Nice.
Discount on the price.
Nice.
That way you can actually participate in our weekly small group sessions, which we do every Wednesday. We have small group sessions. Sometimes 10 or 15 people come together with a couple of fundraising experts. And we actually have a really interesting time. Now, to the point of what we've been talking about today, Andy, last week, I'm hosting one of those sessions, one of those groups at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I went in with a couple of topic ideas, but we always start by saying, okay, who's brought what questions into the group?
Good. And
people give us their questions, we make a list, and then we spend the hour talking about the questions, discussing the questions that people come in, and everyone participates in those discussions. At the end of the session, I said, another possibility is that I came in with a couple of topics, and next week, would you like me to cover the topic I came in with? I said, wiggle your fingers if you want me to cover these topics. You know what happened? Nobody wiggled their
I love that. Humility is the greatest gift of all.
Right. And why is that appropriate for this particular conversation? Because people want to be where they are, not where I want them to be. As a trainer, you have to remember that.
Yeah. So I started out in this work learning community organizing 40 years ago. And the first thing they taught me as an organizer was start with people where they are, not where you think they should be. And it's true in any form, any aspect of life, what you just said. That's big wisdom.
Yeah, it really is an amazing piece of wisdom. And it's so hard to get out of our own brains, right? Even though we know it.
It's hard. It's a practice. It's meditation is a practice. Yoga is a practice.
It's hard.
Getting out and walking is a practice. Doing that is a practice. It's a muscle you have to develop.
It is truly a muscle. And the more you know about something, the harder it is to do. Right. So I find that when people ask me capital campaign questions, I know bookfuls of stuff about capital campaigns.
Right.
It's really hard for me to say to you, Andy, when you ask me a capital campaign question, gee, Andy, what do you think the right way to approach that is? It's really hard because I know what the right way is.
Because you have so much expertise, you want to answer the question. Yeah, right on. Let me give people one more training tip as we're winding down here. And maybe this wasn't clear, but I'll make it super clear now. I think the most content material you can deliver in one chunk without giving the group a chance to work with it is about 20 minutes. And in some cases, it might be 8 or 10 minutes of stuff. Like, here's some information. Here's the exercise. Go do this. And so as you're thinking about whatever your activities are, you want to chunk this out. Here's some material I'm going to present. Here's an opportunity for people to work with it. Here's the reflection part. But if you're actually like giving people an hour and a half of stuff and then you're saying, here's 10 minutes to work on it.
No. That's
not good. That's not good. So when I'm timing stuff out, most of my content chunks are like 20-ish minutes or less. So if you can stick to that, you're going to be good at this because you're giving the work to the group to do.
So Nana, our friend from the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, has asked this question. How can a trainer design training to involve trainees with different working styles and equally and effectively? How do you think about doing that, Andy?
Ask me again because I'm responding to chat. I have a problem.
Different learning styles. She wants to know how to accommodate different learning styles in a training. What are the
okay. This is great. Yeah, I get the question. So, design. And I'll give you an example of this. I was doing a board fundraising training on Zoom, right? Here we are. And the biggest challenge for me is like, what sort of kinesthetic learning can we work into a Zoom thing, right? So my solution was, when we got to a point, I said, I want everybody on this board, I'm going to give you 90 seconds. I want you to get up. I want you to walk around the house. I want you to find an object that's meaningful to you that relates to the mission of the organization you're serving tonight. I want you to bring that object back to the screen. I'm going to put you in pairs using the breakout room function, and I want you to describe the object to your partner and why it's meaningful to you. So I physically gave them an opportunity to get up, move around, find something, bring it back, and like hold it while they were talking about it. And so that was an opportunity for the kinesthetic learners to do that stuff. For the reading and writing people, it's some of the things like, here's a prompt, right? Here's a question I want you to take. Before we talk about this, I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes to sit and write the answer to this question from your own perspective. And this gives the reading and writing folks the chance to sit, be quiet, process the content, write with it. That'd be another example. For the auditory people, small groups, right? Breakouts, let them talk to each other. And for the visual folks, I would try and find some images that are interesting to look at, but also maybe there's some images where you could put it up on the screen. You could say, somebody describe what's going on here. And how does this picture, how does this cartoon, how does this relate to the conversation we're having tonight? So they can actually process stuff visually and talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, Andy, those are really wonderful answers. As you can tell from listening to Andy, first of all, he is a master trainer, as I began this session by saying. And second of all, while really good training looks simple, to actually design it isn't. So, right? It isn't, because there is a lot you have to keep track of. There's a lot you need to know.
Yeah.
There is a lot. You're trying to accommodate many learning styles. You're trying to get people to say the content that you want them to say.
But don't intimidate these people by saying that.
But here's what I encourage all of you to do. With your staff, with a small group of people, do one training exercise. Try it and see what happens.
Right.
Tell them you're doing it. Like anything else in this world, you get better the more you do of it. So don't let yourself be intimidated. Do a little training. If you have a staff of fundraisers, get them together and say, we're going to do a little exercise on elevator questions, right? And then break them up into little pieces and have them do it. So
break them up into little groups, maybe not little
groups. Did I say pieces?
Don't break them into little pieces, please. Yes, I think that's right. Now, I want to give you a piece of advice that the capital campaign people might fight me on, but a little controversy is good.
It's because I got one minute and then I can't.
I have done a lot of solicitation trainings over the years. We do role plays. Obviously, we get people in pairs or small groups, and they practice with each other. And like they say, you're my prospective donor, and this is who you are, and we practice on each other and so forth. And then we debrief it. Excellent. What I'll then say to them is, if this works for you, what I want you to do is identify 3 people who aren't in the room that you could have this conversation with as practice. And I want you to call them up and say, I just went to solicitation training. I'm learning how to ask for money in person. It's a little intimidating. May I come and practice on you?
I love it, Andy. That's
just so
great.
We're clear, it's a real ask. I hope you give me money, but more than the money, I need the feedback. I need somebody that's intelligent, that I can practice this conversation. You can tell me how to make it stronger. May I come and practice on you?
Yes, Andy, I love that. It's a wonderful way to conclude. Let me remind you all that we have a special going on for the Essentials Toolkit. You will be getting an email shortly, like in half an hour, which gives you the link to follow if you want to join us over the summer, even while we're not doing these toolkits. We would love to have you on. You can get a sense of what the Capital Campaign Toolkit is all about. And you can join us in a small group session where you can talk about the things that are troubling or making you curious. Thank you so much, Andy, for being here. It's a pleasure to do something with you again. We don't do it anywhere near enough.
We should do it more.
And thank you for all of you who were with us today. Amy and I will together be back next week, and we will see you then.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing Amy and Andrea together again, because they're awesome together. All right. Thank you all for being here today. I enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Bye.
See you guys.
Thanks for joining Amy and Andrea for today's All About Capital Campaigns. To learn more about them and their work together, go to capitalcampaigntoolkit.com.